good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to host this event on the 2023 World Development Report. This year's edition of the report focuses on migration, a topic that has been of central concern to U.S. policymakers in recent years, both domestically and of course, overseas. Domestically, we went through numerous contentious debates over the Muslim ban, over the border wall, over family separation, as well as over last week's expiration of Title 42 restrictions on asylum applications. Those restrictions, of course, originally instated by the Trump administration, at least nominally in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, have now ended, and so far so good. It seems like we'll talk about that in a bit. Meanwhile, what one might call the regular immigration bureaucracy struggles and has struggled for years to deal with backlogs, and I think is a source of frustration and certainly of red tape for immigrants, their relatives, and businesses alike. Internationally, major refugee crises involve millions of Syrians who left their country in response to the atrocities committed by the Assad regime. Millions of Venezuelans have been displaced by the failed experiment of Bolivarian socialism, and millions of Ukrainians who fled from Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine now find themselves in other European countries. Meanwhile, we have Rohingya fleeing persecution in Myanmar, Afghan families fleeing decades of armed conflict and the return of the Taliban. So that's not a great picture on the refugee side. At the same time, on the more labor-oriented side of migration, the COVID-19 crisis and nativist policies like Britain's exit from the European Union have led to the introduction of new barriers to immigration of all kinds. With that, maybe not super uplifting background in mind, today we'll learn about the World Bank's view of migration, both as a social science phenomenon and as a policy issue. We'll hear about the report's main findings and recommendations, and we'll hear from experts and policymakers seated right here in front of me about the way in which the United States is responding and should respond to global migration trends. Now, specifically, the proceedings will unfold as follows. First, Toin Do of the World Bank will present the report. Toin is co-director for the 2023 World Development Report and a lead economist in the World Bank's Development Research Group. Then after Toin's presentation, we will hear comments by Katie Tobin, who is Senior Director for Transborder at the National Security Council, which oversees all issues related to United States border security. Then Alex Nowrasteh, Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and Tara Watson, Director of the Center on Children and Families, soon to be renamed, I believe, at the Brookings Institution, will weigh in after Katie. We'll then have a conversation among ourselves, take questions from you all and from our online audience. Our online audience can submit questions by using a hashtag that I think one person ever has used, or by emailing Katrina Fee. This information is on the event page, and so I'm not going to try and spell out email addresses or hashtags. Instead, I'll refer you to the page you're physically on as we speak. So with all the logistics out of the way, Toin, delighted to welcome you. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Stan. So I'd like to thank the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this event and all the discussants for taking the time to have a discussion after this presentation. So I welcome you here and also all our listeners online. So let me start straight into the presentation. So this year's WDR is World Development Report, so you will hear WDR quite a bit as an acronym that has become part of our lexicon but might be new to you, is on migrants, refugees, and societies. So I'm here to present the main findings of this report, but I'd like first to acknowledge that this is the work of a big team, 30 people, and some of them are in the room, and I thank you for coming. So we've been working for 18 months. We have had an academic committee, and some of those members are also sitting here in the room, and also a more policy-oriented committee that has been working with us throughout this entire journey. So as is very common, I'm happy to privatize the credit and mutualize the criticism that will come out of this discussion. So let me jump straight into the issue. First, as is not necessarily common for other institutions, we define the migrant as someone who does not have the nationality of the country he or she is living in. So this is a kind of departure from being foreign-born or other definition you might have heard of. And with this definition and the discrepancy between citizenship of the person and citizenship and country they are in is going to define the entire tension that we are going to discuss. So with this definition in mind, we're revisiting a little bit the numbers, and I'd like you, from those numbers and those graphs, to remember three things. First, beyond the fact that there are 184 million migrants and refugees throughout the world, which is 2.5% of the world population. First is migration is also and foremost a phenomenon between countries of low and middle income to countries of low and middle income. So it's not just low-income countries migrating to high-income countries. The second fact is refugees are mostly hosted in developing countries. Second fact I would like to bring to attention. So out of the 35 plus million, 3/4 of them are in low or middle income countries. And then the third fact is most countries there is no such thing as countries that are origin countries or countries that are destination countries, but most countries are both, and this phenomenon is going to increase over time in the sense that countries will be receiving migrants, but also will be sending workers abroad. Migration is a result of arbitrage, of adjustment to welfare gaps, and here on this map, whether you take income per capita, whether you take human development index, most of the migration corridors are going to be driven by gaps in those welfare differentials. So what we wanted to do in this report is first take a picture of what is happening, but also look at some of the main determinants of migration to have a somewhat forward-looking view on what migration is going to look like. And in terms of the drivers that we believe are important, are going to reshape migration flows and are going to be very high in the policy agenda, the first one is one about demography. So demographics, we believe, is going to change the global labor markets and will intensify the competition for workers. So on this graph, you have on the top Italy, the different age pyramids for Italy. The one on the left is the age pyramid in 1950. The one in the middle is today's. And the one on the right will be the age pyramid in 2050. So just as a reminder, the actors of the demography of 2050 are born today. So in a sense, those extrapolations are not coming to too much uncertainty. So Italy is a population that is aging. I think it's among those countries like Japan, one of the first countries where the age pyramid is actually inverting or is about to invert. As an example, in Italy, if we have 60 million people today, the country is going to have around half of that population at the end of the century. If we take the example of South Korea, we're talking about 1 out of 6 South Koreans by the end of the century who will have 80 years or above. Not 65, we're talking about 80 years. So 1/6 of the population will be 80 and above. Now let's move to the bottom line before going to the middle one, is countries, low income or lower middle income countries such as Nigeria that are still very young, and the population is still expanding at a very high rate. We're talking about 7 children per woman in Niger, and Nigeria is in the course of becoming the second most populous country by the end of the century, after India. And so and if you look at the middle row, countries like Mexico, but many others, Turkey, Mexico, Malaysia, and you name it, are countries that are well engaged in what we call their demographic transition. So from a young country, the population is aging. And what does it mean? It means that they are going to become countries that move from being only sending migrants abroad, are also going to receive migrants at home. So what we are seeing for the years to come is a change in how the global labor markets are going to behave, with a change in the demand from aging countries, but no new demand coming from middle-income countries. Second factor that we'd like to draw your attention on is the one on climate. The change in temperature is going to generate not only a decline in income, but a threat to the habitability of places. And so those two will concur to increase the pressures to change places. And if so far movement has been at short distances, meaning within countries or to close neighboring countries, the big question is to what extent those movements are going to become moved from being internal, from being cross-border. And in that situation, what policies are being taken today to mitigate climate change, what policies are being taken today for countries to adapt to the effect of climate change is going to be critically determinant as to whether climate change is going to create migration that is remaining internal or is going to exacerbate the current trends in cross-border migration. So as you can see, you can guess right away that one of the key tenets is that migration is not a monolith. Everybody is not migrating for the same reason. Everybody is not the same. Every migrant is not identical. And so what we try to bring as a decision tool, as an analytical framework to think about migration is what we coined the match and motive matrix. So what does it mean? It means that people differ by their match to the destination country and differ by the conditions under which they migrate. And this determines the policy space that we want to think about when we want to manage different types of migration. So let me jump straight into our framework. So think about one first lens is an economic lens where the movement of a migrant determines the impact it will have on the destination society. And once again, given that destination countries have a say in who migrates, while origin countries don't, then we want to put ourselves in the perspective of the destination countries. And from an economic lens, what the trade-off will be is going to be the benefits that a migrant brings with his skills and his other attributes on the labor market, and this compared to integration costs when there are. And the tension between the benefits and the costs determines whether there's a strong or weaker match for the migrants migrating to a given destination country. In a way that is not related to an economic view of migration, you have the legal view of migration. The international approach recognizes that under some circumstances, when there's a legitimate fear for migrant safety when he or she is being returned home, there is a responsibility from the international community to host the migrant. So that's what we call the motive axis, which is if the fear at the origin is high, destination countries have the duty to host the migrants as refugees. And when the fear subsides and the opportunity of destination dominates the motive for migration, then we're in a space where there is discretion from a legal standpoint, from the destination country's standpoint. So an economic approach, an international approach, and when we all overlay them, we have what we call our match and motive metrics. And the idea, this creates 4 quadrants for which the policy space are well identified. And here again, the main objective is really to understand that migration differs by who migrates and under what circumstances. And so the policy instruments to address those migration flows should be adapted to who migrates and under what circumstances. So we define when there's a very strong match, but the migrant moves for opportunities, that's the space of most economic migrants and the bulk of cross-border movement. On the other side, on the other hand, when match are weaker and the motive is driven by fear at the country of origin, we're dealing with refugees. And finally, the bottom left quadrant is one where there is more issues, is when the migrants don't qualify for refugee status and at the same time have a weaker match with the country of destination. And that's what we call distressed migrants. So let me go over those in turn. The challenge for most economic migrants is to maximize the gain for all. There is economic benefits, and policies has a role to play to increase those benefits further. In the case of refugees, we are talking about ensuring the sustainability, because once again, it's the international responsibility to be shared among all countries in the international community. And finally, for the case of distressed migrants, the issue is really an issue of reducing the need for those movements, absorb the migrants in the society of destination, or return them in a humane fashion. So these are the issues at stake for that category. So when the match is strong, then what is the policy space? First, for country of origin, being a large source of revenues through remittances, a source of knowledge transfers. For country of origin, embedding migration as a strategy for development is a way to maximize the benefits, protecting migrants in the country of destination. In the country of destination, maximizing the benefits involves fighting discrimination, recognizing skills, and also when migration has adverse effect on the local population, having active labor market policies or social protection. In the case of refugees, the issue is ensuring sustainability, but what else is also allowing migrants to reach autonomy. Taking the example, for example, of Venezuela, Venezuela and Colombia. Colombia granted legal rights to migrants right away, allowing them to look for a job, allowing them to move freely within the country to find better job opportunities. So not only it's about giving them protection, but also allowing them to increase the match, because once migrants are given protection, they behave as any economic agents looking for labor market opportunities. And finally, the quadrant that we believe to be small in numbers, but large in terms of political controversies and media coverage is distressed migration. And here we look at different experience, and we identify three main issues to look into. First, extending the scope of international protection, because migrants, those types of migrants first, don't qualify as refugees, but as the US did for Haiti, have temporary form of subsidiary protection in order to account for the fact that migration, the motive for migration is not necessarily just an economic one. And at the country of origin, obviously the role of economic development to provide alternative to disorderly and dangerous migration. So the role of development in this case is critical, so that not only, it's not about whether development is going to increase or decrease migration, but development is going to allow some to not migrate and empower others to migrate in better conditions. And in the meantime, the availability of more legal ways, legal pathways will allow to change the incentives of migrants. So you have here the different set of policies for different types of migration, but we would like to finish with a message is, in order to have a different migration policy, we want to make policy differently. And what do we mean by this is increasing the scope of multilateral cooperation, whether it's between countries, when we're talking about more type of bilateral labor agreements, but also internationally when it comes to burden sharing in the case of refugees. The second point, and I think this is very relevant for organizations like ours, because our way to engage is with sovereign governments. I mentioned at the beginning that migrants are characterized by being citizens of a country in which they don't live in. So the way to engage one way to engage is to have additional financial instrument, so that sovereign countries who maximize the welfare of their own citizens can also, through those financial instruments, also incorporate the welfare of non-citizens. And finally, inclusive decision-making, where more voices need to be heard. So in some cases, Migration policy is in the realm of the Ministry of the Interior. In other places, voices to social partners is being heard. The voice of migrants themselves, so the diaspora is being heard. And inclusive migration policy might be able to open new doors for alternative policies. So I'm going to stop here and finish with the key messages. The one main message is that migration, given the trends in demography and in climate change, is going to be necessary for countries, and this at all levels of income. And the other two, which are what I'm repeating from before, is when the match is strong, meaning there is gains to be had for the migrant, for the origin country and for destination country. There's a policy space which is comfortable to make those gains larger. When the match is weaker, when we're dealing with distress migration, when we're dealing with refugees, this is where international cooperation comes in. And finally, just to repeat the later slides, the need to have different ways to work together in order to find different types of policies. So I'll stop here and thank you for taking the time to listen here and online.
Thank you. And now I will just briefly announce Katie Tobin. Katie, welcome. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. Migration is a topic that is close to my heart and a central focus of my work with the Biden-Harris administration. I first wanted to say thanks to Stan and to the American Enterprise Institute for inviting me to speak with you all today, for hosting this event, to Tuan and to the World Bank for making migration the topic of your 2023 World Development Report. I read the report this weekend and think it is such an important contribution to the global discourse on this topic, so thank you. I honestly think we need more economists focused on this issue. I think the concept that you outlined on the match and motive matrix is brilliant, and I will speak more to that in a bit on how I think it applies in the US context. As mentioned at the beginning, I serve as Special Assistant to the President in the White House National Security Council, covering among many other topics, migration. President Biden has often said that migration is one of the existential challenges, not only facing the United States, but governments around the world at this moment in time. How we deal with it today will shape decades to come. This gives those of us working on this topic a great sense of responsibility to try to get it right, and it's certainly not easy. While this is a global challenge, it has become more of a regional challenge here in the Western Hemisphere than we've ever seen before. According to the State Department, at least 1/5 of the world's forcibly displaced, which we from the UN understand to be about 100 million, are in the Western Hemisphere. So this creates operational and political challenges, not just for the United States, but for all of our neighbors that we're jointly grappling with this. You just have to turn on the TV these days to know that migration has been on the forefront of the political discourse in the United States in recent weeks. Last Thursday, May 11th at 11:59 p.m., we shifted from the Title 42 public health order to our normal Title 8 immigration processes at the southwest border. With that, we ushered in a set of ambitious new policies that aim to do exactly what your report described, match the need in the United States with the motives for people that are on the move. It's a really interesting moment in time right now in the United States because we are actually facing higher labor demands than we have in a really long time. And I think it's safe to say, to quote the report, that the match is strong in the United States, that migration to the United States does yield benefits that exceed the costs if we get our policies right, and that is the real challenge. I won't pretend to be an economic expert, but the reality is we currently have at least 10 million job vacancies right now in the United States. On top of that, we are creating new jobs this year as we're breaking ground on key infrastructure projects under the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, new green jobs as we implement the Inflation Reduction Act. This is an exciting time in America. And as our economy grows, we need workers that we just don't have enough of. So it is in our interest to bring people in and to stay competitive globally. We hear from Republican and Democratic governors and mayors all the time about the fact that they need more workers in their states and in their cities. So the challenge is putting these pieces together and doing it in an orderly way. This is what me and my team and so many others in the Biden-Harris administration have been working on since day one. You hear us talk a lot about legal pathways. We're extremely focused on, one, increasing the number of legal pathways for people migrating to the United States, and two, making it easier for them to access those legal pathways. To oversimplify it, we assess that there are three primary reasons why people are seeking to come to the United States. One, for economic opportunity. We have lots of jobs and we have higher wages than a lot of countries in the region. Number two, family reunification. A lot of people have family here and they've been separated a long time. They want to be with their family. And three, protection. As was noticed in the last presentation, we have a lot of people fleeing persecution, fleeing hardship in their home countries, and they're seeking safe haven in the United States. So how do we ensure that we have the available legal pathways that match those motives? The obvious answer, honestly, is that we reform our laws. And we would love to see Congress act on this. But without Congress, we have had to be very creative in the last 2 years. In year one of the administration, we focused a lot on turning back on and expanding existing labor protection, family unification pathways, with a particular focus on Central America, where we were seeing the highest numbers arrive to our southwest border. We did things like invest in the labor ministries in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and make it easier for people to access the H-2A and H-2B seasonal worker programs. We more than doubled issuances of H-2s in Central America in FY22. We also turned back on the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, the Central American Minors Program. It goes sort of without saying, but coming out of COVID, we also worked really hard to reduce immigrant and non-immigrant visa backlogs at our consulates in key countries where we were seeing high rates of outflows. Year two and now year three, we are starting to make some really big moves and announcing a lot of new legal pathways. I wanted to reference two from last year. When we had new sudden displacement crises, one, the war in Ukraine, and then later in the year, we started to see really high numbers of Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians arriving to the US. We worked to establish new innovative humanitarian parole programs, specifically targeted to those populations. We made them sponsorship-based programs, so people had to have someone in the United States that would come forward and apply on their behalf. We made these programs extremely easy to access through the use of technology. So instead of having to wait years for a visa appointment or for refugee resettlement, you could access this program on your phone. We're able to streamline the processing and approve people within a matter of weeks. We saw these programs have a dramatic impact on irregular migration to our southwest border. With each of these programs that we announced, first Uniting for Ukraine, then in October of 2022, the Venezuela process, and then in January of 2023, expansion of that for Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. Each time we saw over a 90% drop in irregular migration, and we saw thousands of people arriving on planes, quickly getting work authorization, contributing to our economy, reuniting with family, accessing protection. So these are sort of, is an example of sort of the innovative ways in which the US is seeking to more quickly match the needs in the United States and address also the really urgent humanitarian needs of people that are fleeing and seeking to come to our country. Surrounding May 11th, we made a new series of announcements that further seek to expand pathways and make them more accessible. We announced that we'll be establishing regional processing centers across the Western Hemisphere. We also announced new family reunification parole programs for the 3 Northern Central America countries as well as Colombia. With the regional processing centers, the goal is to make it easier for people to access these legal pathways. We have found as we've expanded our legal pathways that many of them are actually undersubscribed. Sometimes people need more support. They need someone to guide them through the process. So we're hoping that these regional processing centers will again help make that match. But it's not all about the United States, and we recognize the multilateral component of this. And I appreciated that what the report said about if the match is weak, the costs need to be shared multilaterally. We get that. The United States gets that. The Biden-Harris administration gets that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we are doing about that. So in June of 2022, President Biden mobilized 21 countries in the Western Hemisphere to adopt the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. This is our signature framework to have a common approach to managing migration in the Western Hemisphere. Under Pillar 1 of the LA Declaration, there's a huge focus on this concept of the match and motive matrix. We see that the majority of the countries in the majority of displaced people in the Western Hemisphere are indeed being hosted by middle and low-income countries. These are countries that are under incredible strain by the millions of people that have entered their country. So we have called for, under Pillar 1, far more support for the countries that are on the front lines that are hosting these populations. The US, through the State Department and USAID, we have delivered a total of $2.4 billion in humanitarian assistance and $2.1 billion in development, economic, and health assistance in the Western Hemisphere in the last 2 years. But in addition to what we are doing directly, we have also worked more with the World Bank, with the Inter-American Development Bank, to provide concessional lending to these countries in the Western Hemisphere that are middle income, may otherwise not be eligible for this financing, but because they're hosting tens of thousands or millions of refugees and migrants, really do need access to more support. We've done this in countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, and most recently Costa Rica. This has enabled those countries to pass temporary protection policies, regularization plans, policies that integrate and welcome migrants and refugees, prevent onward movements, and fuel human smuggling networks. And we will continue to do that work alongside other partners. We have also, under the LA Declaration, called on more countries to also expand their own legal pathways. And you heard when we announced the regional processing centers last month that we did so alongside Canada and Spain, who have also committed to take more cases from the Western Hemisphere through this joint initiative. And then, of course, the focus in the report on origin countries and the need to focus on that as part of the solution. We feel strongly that that is important too. That's reflected in the root causes strategy that the Vice President has championed since 2021. The Vice President has worked to bring the private sector to the table through the call to action. We've worked with 47 companies and organizations that have committed to invest $4.2 billion to create economic security for people in the region. So in closing, the Biden-Harris administration appreciates both the moral responsibility and the strategic opportunity that migration presents. It's at the heart of our domestic and our foreign policy agendas. We do not always get the match perfect, But I am proud to be a part of an administration that recognizes the value of migration and is innovating and testing new ideas to get it right. We are grateful for multilateral organizations like the UN, like the World Bank, for stepping up and contributing to this issue as well. We really need everybody at the table. So thank you again, and I really look forward to the discussion today.
All right, thank you both for your comments. I think that was an excellent overview, both of the report and of really everything that's happened in immigration policy over the past 2 years, at least, as far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned. I wanted to turn to Alex and then to Tara to hear what they thought of the report and of Katie's remarks, and then after we hear from the two of you, we can have a little more informal conversation, and I will ask my burning questions. Alex, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so first off, thank you very much for the invitation, Stan, and thank you for writing such a wonderful World Development report. This is a really comprehensive, thorough report full of data and insights about how migration works globally. So thank you for putting that together. I'm struck, I saw a chart in there that I've seen occasionally throughout my career, which is the place premium. The wage increase that a worker can expect coming to the United States. And the median wage increase, the wage increase for a migrant from the median country, developing country, can expect a 5-fold increase in wages on the lower end for lower end workers coming to the United States. It's an enormous economic benefit for the migrant, but also for the country where those individuals eventually settle. This has been true for a long time. I suspect it will continue to be true for a long time, and even if the demographic trends continue, as we think will increase going forward. Still, though, we have no reform. We still have we have a relative immigration liberalization over the last couple of years with the Biden administration, starting from a low point, which, thank you very much, by the way, for doing that, turning around a lot of the policies from the previous administration, let me put it that way. So thank you for taking some big steps and opening it up. I just am concerned that a lot of the reasons why we haven't had liberalization in the relatively recent past, comprehensive reforms or large-scale reforms, will continue in the future, even though we're staring at these very large benefits. But I do think it's wonderful to have these benefits described in a very accessible, well-researched, well-written, and clear way by the world in the World Development Report.
Tara, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for hosting this, Stan. And I really also appreciate the focus of the report on migration. It's part of the development economics framework that sometimes gets overlooked. As a US policy person, I also appreciated the match and motive matrix because it really highlights how policy can shift migrants from part of the graph where they are not well matched, they are not contributing economically, to the part of the quadrant where they are contributing economically. And I think smart policy has the opportunity to really shift most migrants into that upper part of the graph there. I also really appreciated Katie's comments and have liked seeing much of what the Biden administration has done, including the humanitarian parole efforts. However, I would love to see Congress take action. An administration can only do so much because as soon as the administration is over, a lot of those decisions can be undone. And so, working within a constrained system, there are a lot of creative ideas happening, but we need to get Congress to recognize the imperative. For me, there's an economic imperative and a demographic imperative to expanding our immigration flows through expanding our legal channels. And most of that has to come through congressional action.
Very good. Thank you, Tara. I have a few questions. I'm going to start with giving both Tuan in particular the opportunity to respond, and Katie, if there's anything you want to say, respond to what Alex and Tara said. But Tuan, any comments after what we've heard?
No, so
Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you for recognizing that all the work that has gone into this. I think for us first is to see how what we've done by looking at every country in the world, whether it's a sending or receiving country, seeing that there is some echo in countries such as the US is a kind of good litmus test for this report. And I think as we are starting to disseminate across the world, Xavier, one of the co-authors, is in Germany. Charles is in Turkey. So I think having first this sign that there is some relevance to the policy debate in the US is giving us a lot of energy to keep and disseminating the report elsewhere.
Tuan, could I ask you a few questions that relate to some of the things you presented? The first one is on the demographic transition that you talked about. You showed the age distribution for Mexico as it has evolved. Now, there's a paper from a few years ago by Gordon Hanson. It's titled something like "The Mediterranean is the New Rio Grande," where he does exactly this, right? He goes over the change in the age distribution in Latin America and says that, soon the immigration pressures in the Western Hemisphere will be dramatically reduced, and they will instead intensify on the sort of southern periphery of Europe. I think the latter we've definitely seen. The former, I don't think we've seen at all so far. And so, in this paper, it's like 10 years ago by now. I don't know how far out he is forecasting. That seems like quite a bit. Do you feel like that those pressures are going to go away soon? Are there other countries in Latin America that have a completely different age distribution or that are evolving differently? How do you see that? Because I think the Mexico picture is pretty striking, but I don't know how applicable that is to the whole hemisphere. And if it is, then why aren't we seeing much more of a reduction in flows?
So we do see that the net migration Mexico to the US is now negative. So there are more people coming back to Mexico than people are leaving Mexico to the US. And I think when we look at this and we look at countries at different stage of their demographic transitions, that's a phenomenon that we are expecting to see more and more. And Mexico is very much advanced in this demographic transition.
And so why? Because that's not how. If you just follow media reporting, that's not the impression you get. And is it that other countries in Latin America are at a different stage?
I think other countries in America are at a different stage, and the distance to the US is also different. So all this plays into the decision to migrate.
And so then separately, so we have that age transition. How much of the push does that explain? Because of course, the events that unfolded in Venezuela triggered immense flow, and crime in Central America triggered immense immigration flows. And I think there are countries in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, where we've also seen these enormous flows unleashed. Just in terms of magnitude, those sort of permanent age distribution-driven flows versus just countries failing completely. How important are those two drivers?
So if you look at the numbers I showed you before, we're talking about 35 million refugees out of a population of 200 million or so migrants overall. So we're really talking about different orders of magnitude when we look at what the so-called economic migration compared to refugees, so forced displacement. And I would bet that ratio is inverted when you look at space taken on a newspaper. But I think that's one of the big challenges is not, that the policies for forced displacement, distress migration do not overshadow the need for different type of policies for the economic migration.
And those two drivers how correlated are you? Are they the fear at origin and opportunity at destination? Because you often, you'll hear migration advocates sometimes say that it's very difficult to disentangle those two push factors. Is that something you would disagree with, or?
I think the first, because the numbers are so different, we're talking about different orders of magnitude, and also the conflict and fragility. There are some places where we know, but who would have predicted Ukraine 2 years from now? And I think, and who would have thought that Sudan is falling in civil war? I think that correlation is unclear. I think we don't have a very good understanding of the sources of fragility. And we do understand fragility, but when it will translate into outbursts of violence is something we understand much less.
Very good. Katie, I have a few questions for you too. First, on this sort of broader, what does the hemisphere look like point? I know the administration has a root causes strategy that tries to, I guess, reduce fear at origin and increase opportunity at origin, to put it in Tuan's terms. You didn't emphasize that, I think, in your remarks. Could you tell me, how that strategy is going, and then maybe separately, are there countries in Latin America or in other parts of the world, but I think Latin America is the most important, that you are particularly concerned and particularly optimistic about in terms of how they're managing their economies, opportunity they're creating, maybe increases or reductions in outflows?
Sure. Yeah, root causes work is really tough, which I think we can all appreciate. And so we've been really President Biden as vice president was incredibly focused on this, and so it was really important that when coming back in as president, that we reignited that work in Central America, and he asked the vice president to take this on. And we've made progress. I think it's really encouraging to see the investment from the private sector. We've done a lot to put money into the hands of NGOs, civil society organizations, the people themselves. But we have seen, some democratic and backsliding in some of these countries. There's concerns about, the corruption issues, and this gets in the way. This makes it complicated, and our administration's not willing to turn a blind eye to those issues. So it makes the progress slow. In other countries where we're seeing high outflows, we have, very little diplomatic opening to do much at all. And I won't name countries, but it's a challenge.
I was going to hope you'd rank them from good to bad, but that's fine. Yeah.
So yeah, I think where we see the most opportunity in maybe potential for return on investment, to use economic terms, is in investing in these middle-income host countries in the region that already have a long-standing history of solidarity. Countries like Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, Costa Rica, these are countries that have long traditions of welcoming their neighbors. They have strong legal frameworks. They have relatively good, economies that have been really hit by COVID and climate events. But we think that with increased investment from the international community, these countries can really be important players in this broader framework of managing migration. They can host these populations. They can provide them temporary or permanent legal status. And we think that's in the best interest for a lot of these migrants too. Like Nicaraguans, a lot of them would like to be in Costa Rica. I think a lot of them would eventually like to go back home to Nicaragua. We saw with Venezuelans that for years following the initial outflow in 2015, 2017, the majority were staying in South America. That's where they had the family ties. That's where they had, I think a lot of them wanted to be close and had the intention to go back home. It's only sort of when we've seen more of an economic erosion in some of these host countries where we've seen people starting to head north to North America. So we see it as, in more immediate term, a real opportunity with these host countries.
Thank you. Speaking of the immediate term, as you mentioned, the Title 42 restrictions are now gone as of a few days ago. How's it been going? What do you think?
Yeah, it's too early to say. I mean, this is really interesting. Whenever there's a policy transition, we can't draw conclusions too quickly. But we believe very much in the approach that we've put forward. We've been wanting to do this for a long time, and we were really pleased to finally be able to lift Title 42, put back in place Title 8. We think this combination of more efficient processing at our border, and we've surged a tremendous amount of personnel and resources, coupled with all the work we're doing to expand legal pathways, we really do think it's a sustainable and effective approach. But we will, like all of you, we're waiting to see sort of the the impact. But in the first couple of days, we've seen a major drop in encounters.
Very good. I'm going to start asking some questions. Start asking or letting you ask some of your questions. But first, I wanted to give Alex and Tara the opportunity if you have any questions for Tuan or Katie, comments about anything that's been said. Alex, you want to?
So you mentioned very briefly in the report, you have a discussion about the UAE and some other countries where there are large numbers of temporary migrant workers, often, not always, but often working under fairly harsh legal conditions compared to what we want. Martin Roos, who is a social scientist, I believe is at Oxford, has argued that this trade-off between the rights that you grant to migrants and the number of migrants you let in to countries. And you've documented very well, I think, that the huge benefits to the migrants in the host countries. When you take a look at that, is that sort of a pattern that you see, that there's this trade-off between rights and the numbers of migrants a country lets in? And if there is a trade-off, where should the United States, you think, draw the line?
So what we see is when, and I think I'll make an economic argument here, is when supply is so large compared to demand, prices drop. So in a sense, when it's not just the monetary aspect of it, but also other forms of rights. So that's a very supply demand-driven mechanism. And we can see that the incentive for authorities when the legal framework is not necessarily the same as in other countries to adjust the labor market regulation in order to account for those rights. But I would like to highlight that all the Gulf countries are not the same, and a lot of countries such as the UAE and Qatar have gone a long way towards removing, for example, the sponsorship system, introducing more benefits, more protection. So I think reforms take a long time, and those trade-offs are being assessed as reforms are slow to happen in every places. But I think there's a realization that this trade-off doesn't have necessarily to be such in stark terms.
Great.
To the extent that there are still concerns, they've also purchased soccer teams and organized soccer tournaments to make sure that positive attention for those things overwhelms any negative attention they may receive. So, Tara, go ahead.
I guess I have a question about, even for the migrants that are at the top of your chart, so really strong match either because they have very specialized skills or because the host country is in need of just a lot of workers with any skills. Even where the economic case is really strong, so I would put the US in this category, there's still a lot of political resistance to migration. And so even, we have this whole conversation about the border, about asylum seekers. It sucks up a lot of the oxygen. And do you think that's the reason that we can't make progress on some of the places where the economics argument is so clear? Or are there just broader political forces at work that we should be having in the back of our minds as we talk about these policies?
So I don't think I have enough expertise on US public opinion, but how perceptions are formed about the benefits of migration. I think we've been talking many times about whether all the benefits are properly perceived by the population, whether migration is or not the guinea pig for what's the term? Is being blamed for a lot of social transformation. I think it's an open question. So in the case of the US, maybe in the case, I think this mismatch that we all talk about between the actual benefits and the perception is something that is going to persist here as in many other places.
Very good. Let me take a few questions from our beloved audience. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then I will point to you, and then please wait for the mic, and then ask a question, and then try to make it end with a question mark. Let's go over there first.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I am an author and editorial contributor on technology policy for the Hill newspaper. My question, I think, is for Katie Tobin, but any panelist might be interested in answering it, and that is the rapid development of a special program for Ukraine refugees last year was pretty clear evidence that the United States is quite capable of creating special programs for outside of the Western Hemisphere. So if that is the case, why didn't or couldn't or shouldn't the United States have comparable special programs for Syrian refugees, for Yemeni refugees, for Horn of Africa, Somali refugees, for Rohingya, for any of a number of other regions, I suppose including Afghanistan. But if we can do this for one country out of region, why not do it because many of these are indisputably refugees and highly qualified, educated people. So just wondering why was it suitable for Ukraine but not for Syria or whatever? Thank you.
Katie, you want to respond to that?
Sure, no, it's an excellent question. It's something we grapple with quite a bit. I didn't speak about it in my remarks, but another big focus of the Biden-Harris administration has been working to not only build back the U.S. refugee admissions program, but really upgrade and streamline it. So the goal would be that we would use the refugee authority in our immigration laws to welcome refugees from around the world, for Syrians, Ukrainians. So, but I think as many of you around the room know, historically, it can take several years, 2, 5, 10 years for people to be resettled, which is just not sufficient. So we've been working to reduce the time, really like build in efficiencies to the refugee resettlement adjudication, so it goes from a multi-year process to just a few weeks. And we think that that will be more appropriate to apply to some of these urgent refugee crises that arise in the future. And that is our plan in the Western Hemisphere, that we're actually going to try to do this expedited refugee processing. The use of humanitarian parole, we often find we have a justification to use it if there's an urgent humanitarian need or a significant public benefit. But we would prefer to use refugee resettlement. It's a more durable solution for refugees. They come here with permanent status. They can bring their family members. So it's a long story, but we would always prefer to use refugee resettlement as the pathway over parole if we had the choice.
On a somewhat related note, if you're interested, last week I hosted an event here on the Welcome Corps, which is a new program that allows for private sponsorship of refugees, so not through the traditional resettlement agencies. And that program, once it starts working, may help with some of the populations you mentioned. I wanted to, Katie, to ask you a different question. Anyone else should feel free to weigh in. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. The administration, of course, also, I think on a bipartisan basis, passed the CHIPS Act. I think for a number of those industrial policy initiatives, there's a concern that there's a number of relatively specific high-skilled occupations where the U.S. struggles to train people, where numbers certainly are small, where there's a very clearly defined shortage, where you can't train people that quickly because they often require years of higher education. How does the administration think of that? How are you going to make those programs a success if they are pretty reliant often on foreign workers who do not have an easy way to get here, often have to go through lotteries, through years of uncertainty about their future legal status?
Yeah, and this is not my direct area of focus, but of course the priority is retraining Americans to fill those jobs, and we really view this as such an opportunity to transform manufacturing and so many other industries here domestically, but this does create a demand for increased high-skilled labor from other parts of the world, and so that is something that we're working with the State Department on and DHS to find ways again to make it easier for people that have these skill sets that we think can really contribute to implementing these new policies, that we can bring them in faster and have the competitive advantage.
Very good. Different question, inspired by a question from an online question. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I could make the question a little bit better. Who knows if it's better? We'll never know because I'm not going to reveal what the original question was. The way in which the U.S. manages its border and in which the European Union manages its southern border, right, the Mediterranean, and then sort of all the way up to Turkey. Right, there are similarities and differences. Are there lessons you think Europe should learn from the U.S.? Are there lessons the U.S. has learned from Europe? How do you think of those two situations? Do you think they're at all comparable? Europe, of course, has struck deals with a number of the nearby countries that certainly human rights activists, I think, are not super happy about. How do you think of that situation? Is that a place you look to for inspiration? Are there things you think they do terribly in the?
I think we definitely there's a need for discourse and dialogue. I think we're facing a lot of common challenges. I was just a part of an event here in Washington last week with a lot of representatives from European countries on the subject of migration and sharing best practices, and also areas where we think we can really learn from the experiences of other countries. I think Europe was really went through a lot in 2015 with the refugee crisis and instituted a lot of reforms, and so the dialogue is really critical.
Okay.
I mean, if I could say one thing, I think one lesson that Europe could learn from the Biden administration is from the humanitarian paroles that you've extended to Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians, which, as you mentioned in your speech, 95% decline on average in Border Patrol apprehensions. And I think it would be, the whole world should know about that, because there's almost nothing short of a major catastrophe that causes a reduction like that. And it's through liberalization. It's through making lawful pathways into the United States open to people who otherwise would be marching through, many of them through the Darien Gap, be taking dangerous sea voyages, some of whom would die in the deserts of northern Mexico, to say nothing of being abused by smugglers and cartels and everything else. And to give them the option to apply from their home countries, to find a sponsor, and to come into the United States to work, I think is a success that needs to be shouted from the rooftops even louder, both from a humanitarian and economic perspective. And I wish that our friends in Europe would more realize that. They have, of course, in the past at different times with different programs, but that is the real unsung success and lesson that I've gotten from the last several years of the Biden administration, and it's something that I think future administrations should learn from and emulate, and that foreign countries should as well.
You think it's better than bribing Libyan warlords?
I do think that the benefits exceed the costs of letting people migrate lawfully compared to any other alternatives that are available to these governments.
If I can just jump in there, the congressional laws on the books have caps on migration that were set in 1990 in most cases, and so they're just woefully out of date and not providing the legal channels that the economics would imply.
Very good. Any more questions from the audience? Let's go over here on the left.
Hi, my name is Mike Holmes, and this is a question, I guess, mainly for Katie, but anyone can jump in. And correct me if I get these backwards. I think it's the H2A that's uncapped and the H2B that's capped. And you mentioned some of the undersubscription to some of those programs. Even I think Northern Triangle, sometimes there were struggles in filling the additional slots on the H2B. What have been the main, I guess, obstacles to having more people take advantage of those options? And I guess the second part of this, is it purely our policy, or is there even a mismatch in desire of migrants themselves and what our temporary work programs actually offer?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's been a huge focus of the administration to try to maximize the value of the H2A and H2B program. The H2A program, which is for temporary agricultural work, is the one that is uncapped. H2B is for non-agricultural, so tourism and a variety of other industries. Having gotten my hands dirty with this, really gotten into it in the last couple of years, I think it needs a legislative reform. I mean, there's too many steps. It's really complicated, I think, for the worker, the the person sitting in Honduras who wants to come work in agriculture in the United States and the farmer in the US. Like they don't naturally meet. And we have done a lot of work to try to bring the employer and the worker together, but it's been a challenge. I think other countries have had more success. I think Canada has a really good model, and we're in close touch with Canada on their program. But yeah, I think that there is a need to simplify the process and make it far easier for workers to come. I think having it be employer sponsored is something worth taking a closer look at. I think to go back to these parole processes that we've set up, by allowing people that intend to work in the United States to have a sponsor, so somebody that will welcome them, help them to settle here, but not necessarily be their employer, and then have somebody immediately have access to work authorization upon arrival so they can immediately contribute to our economy, I think is a model that has proven to also address some of our economic needs without this sort of convoluted program that seems to be really challenging for somebody to navigate, and then gives a little bit too much power to the employer. So anyway, there's a need for reform.
So on the parole side, if I understand correctly, people have been paroled in under the Uniting for Ukraine program, receive work authorization incident to their parole, right? But not for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Is it on the table to change that, or what's
So same for both programs. We took the U4U, the Ukraine model, and we applied it for Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans.
Oh, so
and
they don't have to
Haitians.
apply for work authorization separately anymore.
Same model.
Okay.
They need to have a U.S. sponsor, someone in the U.S. that supports them and vouches for them, and then upon arrival, they can immediately apply for.
Oh, but they
work.
still have to apply. That's what I'm saying.
That's right.
Okay, I see. Yeah,
Can I just jump in on the H2 program? Another challenge is that some of the key shortage areas that we see in labor market right now are not seasonal. There are things that are longer lasting. So think of things like home health aides, where there presumably is a large immigrant workforce who would be willing to come and do that work. And there's obviously a huge amount of demand, and it will grow in the future. But you can't call that a seasonal job. So it doesn't fit into the program neatly.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sense would be that people who are opposed to large new inflows of immigrants are opposed to having a non-seasonal temporary program, because that's not how guest worker programs typically turn out, right? I think, which may also be a concern with some of the parole programs where people are now paroled in for 2 years. It's not, to me, it's not totally obvious what's supposed to happen once those 2 years are over. Do you know what's going to happen?
Well, to go to your comment on the guest worker program, I do think when it's a well-functioning guest worker program, that is the ideal scenario, that people come, work for a period of time, have an incentive to go back to their home country. It anchors their family in the home country. And then a lot of these programs, if you comply with the terms of the guest worker program, whether to Canada, to the US, so you go home when you're supposed to, then it makes you eligible to have that renewed over and over. So I think that model has proven to be good for both economies, and prevents an entire family from having to be uprooted.
Very good. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has one. Let's go over here.
Hi, Walker Wright. I work here at AEI. Kind of going off of the World Bank's report here, where you talked about distressed migrants and refugees and the kind of idea of spreading the cost and whatnot. This is mainly just to find out more about the literature and the evidence on this in terms of refugees, where we kind of talk about them as just being a cost. I'm aware of at least some literature that shows that refugees, when they're invested in, that they also they contribute to the economy in various ways, dynamism, entrepreneurship, and so forth, if we invest in them up front. And I'm just wondering, is that an outlier in the literature? Is this what you find robustly in the economic literature, because then it strikes me that we should also talk about refugees as also being of an economic benefit to the country as well. So I'd just be curious on what your findings have been on that.
So it depends. Thank you for your question. So it depends very much on the context, on the number of refugees, and also, and what we want to emphasize, the legal environment in which they are. And the example of Colombia, once again, or even, I think we're waiting for results from Ukraine. But if you allow them to, if you allow refugees to work, if you allow them to seek for opportunities, you give them rights, they're economic agents. And in places where there are labor scarcity, then this is also a kind of forced migration at the beginning, but then workers that are going to contribute to the economy. So it really, but once again, it's very different if you put refugees like in Bangladesh in camps and you don't allow them to work, then the fiscal burden on the whole society becomes very large. So you have two polar examples, and then we have everything in between. But I think the question is not whether it's a cost or it's not a cost, because once again, it's a legal obligation for the international community, is how can we lower those costs? And the important is using the economic potential, which brings down the cost, but also gives them the opportunity to empower themselves and become autonomous.
And not just for refugees, for asylum seekers, you also have very different legal treatment even within advanced economies, right? Where in the US, often allowed to work during the procedure.
Correct.
In Europe, much less frequently. Yeah. So, right, and so that obviously the legal status very directly impacts the economic impact. On that, on your matrix, one thing I was wondering about, you define the benefits very narrowly in terms of labor market impact. Of course, for a very common form of migration is for family reunification purposes, where there presumably are large benefits that accrue to family members who are already in the destination country. It feels like you bias your framework a little bit against family reunification by just explicitly not counting benefits like that. How did you?
No,
okay.
So I mean, first we don't want to start to put monetary values on this, but I think just to think about this issue conceptually. And the way we think about family reunification is, let's think about the movement of the entire family, even if it doesn't happen at the same time over time. And so the big question is, conditional on the family to join later on, what is the benefit to the whole society of welcoming a family unit, even if the main working person is going to come earlier?
I see. Well, that is satisfying. Thank you. I think with that, we've reached the end of our program here today. Thank you again to our speakers, our panelists. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the people behind the camera on the internet as well. Thank you and have a good day.